welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Paul. Paul's got his new book finally out, and he didn't take any of my examples of titles he should use, but that's okay because he picked a great one. Paul, would you mind introducing yourself again to everyone out there listening, and also your book, the new title, and its release?
Absolutely. Good to be with you, Robbie. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so we've spoken a few times and I've made reference to a book that I'm putting together. I'm happy to announce that it's now been released and starting to make its way out through outlets, Barnes and Noble and all that, and Amazon. It's called Death to Justice, the shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald. So really taking a deep dive, and I gather, and this wasn't the reason I embarked on writing the book, but I gather it does go into as great a detail, or more detail than any other book has, on the shooting of President Kennedy's alleged assassin, Lee Oswald, on November 24 in 1963, that very fateful weekend in Dallas. So yeah, it's good to be back speaking with you, and yeah, it'll be a good conversation.
Your book title, is that a play on words for Farewell to Justice?
No, that only occurred to me afterwards. I've read that book. I have that book. It's a very, very good book by Joan Mellon. But no, to me, Death to Justice means that no matter how you perceive Oswald's guilt or innocence, the fact that he was killed before he even got to stand trial, that was a death to justice in many regards. I know the American government at the time, after Oswald was shot, they were very concerned about perception, of the United States from other countries around the world, and they wanted to. I make reference to it in my book. They wanted to make sure that democracy and justice was on show with how they handled, or how Oswald would be handled through the United States judicial system. But of course, that didn't get to happen. So I just thought he didn't get to have his day in court. His shooting was a death to justice. So, yeah, but
The shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald was kind of what opened up the door for a lot of people to believe conspiracy and the assassination. It's much like the HSCA concluding that there was probable conspiracy. It was just enough for you can research into it. You might get some crap for doing so, or might get some criticism, but it's on the level where most of the public believes conspiracy in the assassination, and mostly on the point of a carousel or strip club owner killing the alleged killer of the president. But it didn't just do that. It also opened up the door for lots of criticism of people that were involved in the case to also criticize the Dallas Police Department. Especially, like, I mean, if you look at the accounts of Jesse Curry or just people's statements on Jesse Curry, it is not very favorable towards him. I mean, I have clips of him or people calling him an idiot just for going on television and talking to the media. And we've been a little bit critical on him in the past, and for good reason. But when it comes to the overall transfer of Lee Harvey Oswald, obviously, if you're able to dive into it and focus specifically on the Ruby shooting, what were some giant red flags that I guess you might have come across later that aren't necessarily in that main kind of public domain of viewing just a strip club owner killed a killer of a president?
well, Jack Ruby, it's certainly not something I needed to delve in too much, but Jack Ruby, he was obviously affiliated with the mob since his early days in Chicago, and it was probably on those connections that he moved to Dallas in, I think it was 1947. He was involved in gun running, drug running, prostitution, gun running for the days of the pre-Castro Cuban Revolution, and to boot, he was an FBI informant on those gun running activities. So he's all of that aside, he was very close, or made it his business to be very close with the Dallas police. He was always comping them free tickets and drinks to his clubs. So he had the Carousel Club and the Vegas Club. Over the years, wives and girlfriends of Dallas police officers worked for him. He was very, very, probably more so on his side, but he ingrained himself within the Dallas police system, if you like, socially. So when it turned out that it was him that was able to miraculously access the basement of Dallas City Hall, within seconds of Oswald's transfer beginning and Oswald's emergence out into the basement. I mean, I think that's what obviously, for very good reason, brought in the questions very very quickly about it was the fact that it was an inside job. This guy connected to the Dallas police with all the affiliations I mentioned before just happened to be able to get into City Hall that morning, having also been in the been making it his business to be in the corridors of Dallas City Hall the Friday night of President Kennedy's assassination, the Saturday afternoon, Saturday night, coming and going from Dallas police, making out like he was a reporter, trying to enter the outer office of where Oswald was being held, up on the third floor with the homicide and robbery section. All of his activities, leading up to Oswald's shooting, and they were very overt. I came across a lot of testimony, reporters in particular, saying that they saw Jack Ruby. He was at the Friday night or Saturday night. He was giving away tickets and drinks cards to his clubs to the reporters that were at City Hall covering Oswald being held there. So he made himself very, very, very much known, and I think that all just lends to the question of a conspiracy or an inside job into how he would come to shoot Oswald.
Do you believe there was ulterior motives in his relationship with the police and the relationship with the media? Because I think through examining testimony, you can look at he was overall friendly to like every person he met, and like overall, like just overly so. I mean, giving out free passes to any single person, just and you could say he's a publicity hound looking for good business or drumming up business to his club. But there's an ulterior motive when it comes to the police officers and then when it also comes to the media. Media because he's trying to get favorable press for his club. But then when you look at the Dallas police officers, well, that brings up the giant question to did one of his favors or relationship get him into the basement? I've seen plenty of statements from people saying that he must have came down the ramp. They weren't 100% sure and they clarified that. But then there's also like, did someone let him in through a back door? How did he get the information of the transfer? I've seen multiple different ways that he possibly could have gotten that transfer time.
Yeah. I think from the media perspective, there was the place, the City Hall was just absolutely swamped with reporters, people from all over the country and all over the world, especially by Sunday morning. You read about a lot of reporters arriving late Friday, early Saturday from other parts of the country and other countries, but there was only a few people from, reporters from Dallas that were there when Oswald was shot. So someone like Seth Cantor, who was actually he was with the White House press corps, but he was originally from Dallas. He knew. He went back with Jack Ruby. He knew him, and he always testified to never seeing Jack Ruby in the basement and. I don't think even leading up to in the days before. So the people that said that the media that said that they saw Ruby were people from out of town, and they only knew who he was because obviously it had his name on. Well, it was the Carousel Club, and he introduced himself as such. So I'm not sure if any of his relationships or any linkages that he might have had with either cameramen or photographers or reporters had any kind of bearing on him coming to be Oswald's shooter. And I mean, it's in terms of speculating about his linkages with Dallas police. I think it could have easily have been a case of him being the right door being left open for him, and maybe those that swung in to subdue him and make sure that they were close by to him in the first couple of hours that he was in custody after Oswald's shooting, might not have expected the person that they were being tipped off as being Oswald's shooter to be Ruby. Or it could be, if we swing the pendulum the other way, Jack Ruby was well known, and because of his associations with the mob, I think it would have made him a very good candidate to be a kind of a hot potato that either the authorities wouldn't want to handle because of his intelligence linkages, because of his activities with gun running, and because he was associated with the mob. It could just be easily be palmed off as being a mob style hit. So it's, yeah, and I do in my book I do hypothesize a pretty likely scenario. I'm not saying that people that Dallas police that were involved in getting the scene ready for Oswald to be shot, all didn't 100% know that Ruby was going to be the shooter. But I guess because to answer your last point, how did he know? How did he know what the transfer plans were? How did he know to make his to time his entrance into the basement? A lot of people say that Ruby could have been signalled. The annex building, which sits and still does as a building, is only 3 stories high, and its windows look out onto the vacant block next door. And beyond that, the building in which the Western Union office was, and that's where he went to transfer money to Little Lynn, one of his employees, one of the strippers from his club in Dallas that needed money because there was no work that weekend. He closed the clubs down. But people have said that Ruby must have been signalled to make his way from the Western Union to get into the basement and shoot Oswald. But I think quite easily it could have been the other way around. It seems like there was a lot of stalling going on with Oswald up in the 3rd floor. There was Harry Holmes, the postal inspector. There was Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells. There was about 3 detectives watching Fritz interrogate Oswald. It just seemed like it could have very easily been a bit of drawing out until it was seen that Ruby was coming to making his approach to City Hall, and that's what triggered the transfer. It was pretty straightforward from that point. Down the elevator, it would have taken from where he was in Fritz's office to the point where he'd ultimately be shot. It couldn't have been any more than a minute for him to, for Oswald to have gotten to that point. So I think Confederates within the DPD were in on the plot to, were in the plot to contact Ruby. Maybe 1 or 2 people who I name in the book, and the rest were just ready to respond accordingly, knowing that something was going to happen. I think it could have been that concise.
I want to ask about your even speculation about who would be the characters you would point at for the people that might have given Ruby that information. Obviously, it could be accidental. There's the Billy Grammer, which I don't know if you believe, but Billy Grammer saw or heard the threat and realized that the person he had been speaking to over a cup of coffee happened to be the person that was on the phone. Like, even if it's not true or if it is true, that could be one way if we do believe that it is true. But then there's a statement from a woman that worked as a waitress at a restaurant who talked about one of the chief polices. I don't think it's Jesse Curry. It was another person. I don't remember if it's Fritz or not, but came in and was talking about transferring Oswald at 10. And she couldn't recall if she saw Ruby there or not. She thought she did. So, I mean, that could be a possibility if someone's just openly having the conversation, maybe that he might have received that information. Obviously, these are leads and angles that the government pursued. So you're probably not going to get any defamation onto the Dallas police or any type of inside corruption. But if we really examine just cops having this information or certain cops having this information, who would it trace back to that it would end up getting relayed to? Jack Ruby. You'd have to look at police connections. Damn it, he had like 1,000.
Well, and that's an interesting point unto itself. There was of the all the Dallas police that were interviewed for various investigations after the shooting. I think it's about 70 that admitted to knowing and having some kind of acquaintance or friendship with Ruby. And this is obviously in the weeks and months after the shooting itself. So yeah, again, those connections are there. But the thing is, it wasn't such a secret undertaking. We know that Jesse Curry, at around about 6 o'clock on Saturday, the evening before, told members of the press, Oswald will be transferred at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. Come back for then. Now that's over the years. That's kind of been that's changed to Curry said, "Come back, and if you're here at 10 o'clock, you won't have missed anything." But I was able to find corroborating statements from reporters, who were, this was made that were made at the time in the immediate investigations with the Dallas Police and FBI, who said, no, Curry said 10 o'clock. That's when the transfer will take place. So, of course, a lot of the press were getting in, particularly reporters and camera crews were starting to get in by well and truly 8 o'clock. Cameras were being set up outside the jail office where Oswald would come to emerge out of before being shot. So what I'm saying is it wasn't a big secret to begin with that around 10 o'clock would be when Oswald would be transferred. And to speak to that a little bit more, Seth Cantor, who I mentioned earlier, he testified that because he'd been working late hours, he'd woken up at about 20 to 11 that morning, seen the time and remembered what Curry had said the night before about when Oswald's transfer would be. So he rushed to City Hall all the same, thinking that he'd missed Oswald's transfer. But when he got there, he saw that everything was still being set up and that indeed he hadn't missed it. So, it really wasn't a big secret that 10 o'clock was going to be the time of the transfer. But the thing is, and this is probably one of the more little lesser known things that I've uncovered, is that at 20 past 10 on the morning of Oswald's shooting, Curry held court with more of the media in an anteroom up in the third floor, and he was saying words. I've actually got the quotes from the reporters in my book, but he was saying to reporters that we would have transferred Oswald overnight, but because we had threats on his life, but I kept my word to you, the press. So we didn't transfer him. You haven't missed anything. So I mean that's just nuts anyway. But then the reporters, obviously picking up on the lead, said, "Well, how is he going to be transferred?" And again, Curry lays it all out. He said, "We're going to use an armoured truck." And one reporter said, "Where are you getting that armoured truck?" "A local contractor, a local business." "Well, how's the transfer going to start?" another reporter said. And Curry said, "Well, we'll take him down the elevator, out through the basement and into the truck, and that's how it'll be." One reporter remembered someone saying that there'd be snipers on the roofs along the rooftops along the transfer route. So at 20 past 10, there was still this broadcasting of how the transfer was going to happen, and of course we know that that's ultimately that the armoured truck wasn't used anyway, but it wasn't intended to be used. There was a late-minute change. Oswald was changed from being put into the armoured truck because Captain Fritz said it'd be too cumbersome, and if there was an attack, it wouldn't be any good. So the idea was that the armoured truck would be used as a decoy, and Oswald would be loaded into one of two police cars that would accompany the armoured truck on the way to the county jail. But the armoured truck would peel off down one turn on.
I thought it was pretty funny how they were measuring the garage and everything in the armored truck. Like as it was there, I was like, "Well, hold on, we're gonna try and back this thing in there." I was like, "Did anybody ever think about that before the armored truck was even suggested?"
Well, that's another little thing that I uncovered. Apparently, Fleming, the Harold Fleming, who was the managing director of the armoured truck company, I think armoured motor company, said he knew that the truck wouldn't fit down the basement. And he rang back ahead to Captain Batchelor to say, we'll bring the truck, but it's not going to be able to get down the basement. And they were nervous about backing it down anyway. in any regard because it was they were prone to stalling. They had problems with the battery that morning, so they didn't want a repeat of that anyway with Oswald in the back. But the funny thing was, and this came out in a Warren Commission statement by Batchelor, he, Bert Griffin, one of the Warren Commission counsel, said, well, if you were going to use the armoured truck as a decoy, wouldn't the media give away the game when they saw that Oswald had been loaded into a car anyway, and therefore the element of surprise would kind of be lost straight away because they would be reporting what they saw. So anyway, it was just farcical, and I think in amongst all of that chaos, it was very easy to get someone like Ruby in place. I talk about a particular acting detective who was down in the sub-basement locker room for upwards of a couple of hours that morning. And the thing about that locker room is it's where police officers would come and go at the beginning of start and ends of shifts. Obviously, lockers down there. They had vending machines. They had payphones down there as well. And I think that this guy was on the phone, kind of getting reports, finding out what was happening up on the third floor, and in contact with Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby's roommate, George Senator, testified. I don't know how reliable he is, but he testified to Ruby being on the phone that morning to Little Lynn and another couple of phone calls.
Was it Little Lynn or Kathy K? Or not
Karen,
Kathy K, Karen Carlin, yeah.
the same person.
I,
Little Lynn was her.
I thought
her
Little Lynn was Sherry Lynn's uh
no, so Karen Carlin and Bruce Carlin, they were husband and wife, and they were who asked Jack Ruby to meet them at the Carousel Club the night before because she needed money because of the clubs being closed. And Karen Carlin and Bruce Carlin testified to that in the Warren Commission. They were one of only a couple of people that lawyered up for the Warren Commission too. So make of that what you will. But it was definitely Little Lynn, Karen Carlin.
I had like 10 Carousel Club clips of like Carousel stripper girls. And then I realized that there's probably over 50 or 60 or 70 something Carousel Club girls because they would only be there for like a month and then quit because they just couldn't work with either Jack Ruby or just didn't like what the club was. So there's like a revolving door, just like one page, one paragraph testimony, like a 17-year-old girl going, I got a job at the Carousel Club and it was given to me by a Dallas police officer. I was like, well, fantastic. Good for you.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so look, I make the very good case that there were Confederates within the DPD that were waiting or expecting Ruby to be in place and take the shot. One of them I name as Kenneth Croy. Now, to people that are well versed in the JFK assassination, that's not a new name. Kenneth Croy is very, very suspicious for his movements before, during and after the Tippit shooting on November the 22nd. He couldn't account for his movements, and apparently he just happened to be nearby when the Tippit shooting happened. And even though the address wasn't broadcast about where the Tippit shooting took place, he found out where it took place. So Croy is very suspicious, and his movements in Dallas City Hall that morning are very vague. He's not the only one, but he was able to get away by saying, I simply clocked on at 8:30 that Sunday morning. I helped out in the assembly room, which is in a floor above the sub-basement, assigning fellow reserve officers as they clocked on that morning. And he obviously somehow found himself to be in the exact position just behind where Ruby would emerge from. So I contend, and John Armstrong and David Josephs and other researchers like that make the case as well. And obviously Captain Westbrook, William Westbrook, he's right there in the whole framing of Oswald after Dealey Plaza. He's right in the thick of that, evidentially with his own movements. I think he very could easily have been the mastermind behind the shooting of Oswald. There are, just by analysing people's statements of not just what they were doing, but what they saw and attributed other people as doing. I collected them all, and I was able to draw some very, very clear clear narratives of what took place, and it definitely was an inside job, and it was covered up. The cover up started straight away. Sergeant Dean, Patrick Dean, I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He was in charge of overall security at the basement, although he was nowhere near Oswald, where Oswald was shot. He is incredibly suspicious. He had control of the whole scene, and he was able to. It was on his directions that the two reserve officers that were at the far eastern end of the basement were moved. But just before, well, one was at 11:15 that morning. Elvis Brock, he was reassigned from guarding the elevator and the stairwell coming down from the annex building. And then his partner, Worley, he was moved away about 10 or 15 minutes later. So that whole area was completely unsupervised, just not checked. And I believe that's where Ruby was able to come in, having entered from the annex building upstairs, and at a very clear rain, he might have been escorted by Kenneth Croy across the basement car park. Of course, we know that everyone was facing the jail office where Oswald was going to be brought out. That's where all the camera lights and the cameras themselves were facing. I think it could have been as simple as that.
Question for you. How many reporters in the basement were out of town reporters compared to people that were normally covering news segments in Dallas in that area? And then also, how many were reserve officers compared to how many were? Because I'd have to think the main reporters would have been pulled out when the assassination happened. So by that Sunday, they must have gone home or got sleep or done something since they were covering so much.
I can find out the exact number, but
Well, would you say
it's a
most?
surprisingly, yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And it's interesting because come that Sunday morning, obviously it had been announced that apparently Oswald had been charged for killing President Kennedy. So the thought was that he would be less and less visible to them. So other stories started to take a little bit more priority. Because it was just assumed that as soon as Oswald got to county jail, the only time that he would be seen again would be obviously in the trial. So reporters did start to kind of flitter away. Nellie Connolly was due to give a press conference out at Parkland about the condition of Governor Connolly, who was shot alongside President Kennedy. There were there was some reporters that actually, quite a few that actually went down to county jail and were there to record when Oswald arrived at the end of the transfer. So yes, it is when I think about it, it's a very a fairly high percentage that were out of towner reporters that they were actually present there for the shooting. In terms of reserves, there were 23 that were that were accounted for as being at the scene. Now, not all of them were there kind of to witness Oswald's shooting. I say that being at the scene, some of them were assigned to help with crowd control up on Commerce Street. So I calculate that there were 11 or 12 in the basement when Oswald was shot, reserve officers.
Now, do you think that was on purpose, or was that just because the events of the weekend, they probably had all the main people in the beginning, and then by Sunday it came to, because the transfer is still pretty important.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, you look at most of the reserve officers. I mean, they had the option to buy their own uniform. So Kenneth Croy, who I mentioned before, he was in a uniform. So for all intents and purposes, they looked like and would have acted like police officers. You certainly don't see any references from media being able to pick out who was a reserve officer and who was regular Dallas police. So I think it was reinforcements. It was at the end of coming to the end of a very long weekend. They themselves, most of the reserve officers that were called in, they were only called in late Saturday night, the evening before, and excuse me, even that morning. So I don't know if that was poor planning or I'm not sure, but yeah, there's a couple of reserve officers that are pretty suspicious with their accounts and how they flip flopped on statements, what they saw and all that. William Newman is another one. He was positioned right in the, I guess you'd call it the southern end of the basement car park, so literally under Commerce Street. He stayed there because there was and I'm not sure if it's still there, but there was a door down to the sub basement engine room. So that was his job to stand guard there. He'd been a part of the apparent search of the basement car park about an hour earlier. He's suspicious because he was interviewed. He's the only reserve officer to be interviewed 4 times by the Dallas police investigation. And that's because he came out and said that he saw a man walk down the Main Street ramp and then saw him climb through the railing to where, the cars were parked up and where some of the press was standing. This is the railing where basically the cameras were that filmed Oswald shooting. Thing is, where he was standing, he couldn't have possibly seen all the way up to Main Street, the top of the ramp itself, because of how low the ceilings were. He also came out in subsequent statements and said that he wasn't sure if that man was, if he'd seen him walk down before or after the shooting. He then gave a story about that same man getting into a scuffle with members of the media when there's no reports of that happening before the shooting. Whatever happened after and all the chaos is anyone's guess. But this guy's just an example of being a bit suspicious, and there's a couple of other fronts as well that I cover off on him. But he's a bit of a dodgy character. But in all, though, the reserve officers that were there in the basement, they kept they their statements read as if they were just towing a very, very straight line. They didn't give too much away, and did pretty well to not come over as being too evasive either.
I wonder how many people actually that was their real statement, or if they were saying that because they thought, because most of those statements were taken the day of, or was taken like the next few days after.
Next few days, yeah.
I wonder if it was that maybe if they towed the line, they could maybe get a slice of information about something that was going on that would be good for reporting. Because obviously, the weird thing for me and the question I was trying to get the answer out of you from was everything from the when Oswald's arrested up like the midnight press conference, all this, everyone can identify Ruby just acting like a press person. But then when we get to the transfer part, there's like a no identification or I did not see Lee Harvey Oswald. So I go, you don't have people that are in town for that then. Those are out of town people. So that would make sense about that. But also the press credentials thing. I mean, people could understand who Jack Ruby was, but there's even statements from officers that are like, he must have been wearing a press badge or something to be able to get through into the basement. I was like, did you see him wearing the press stuff? And did you bother saying anything? Or you just assumed, oh, he's press, even though it's Jack Ruby and just let him through?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. There was, and I'll come back to that reserve officer Newman because he was identified by another reserve officer of when they were all out at Parkland in the aftermath of Oswald's shooting, of saying to Newman said to this officer, he was identified by him as telling him that Ruby got into the basement because he was wearing a press pass. When that other officer identified Newman as having been the person that said that, Newman got quite agitated and was screaming, mistruth, and strongly denied it. But the thing is, there was no press pass that was found on Ruby after the shooting. He was stripped. He had we know that he had hundreds of dollars of bills on him. For at least an hour and a half to 2 hours, he was getting around in his briefs. There was no record of a press pass being found on him. So that we can discount pretty easily. But in terms of not being able to identify him before it happened, the way that Ruby would have gotten into position, and I'll tell you this right now, I'll save your listeners the suspense, he did not come down Main Street ramp. It did not happen. No one down in the basement saw Jack Ruby come down Main Street ramp, and no one up the top were able to conclusively identify Jack Ruby as coming down the ramp from up there either.
Poor Officer Vaughn. Everyone's throwing him out of the bus. He's like, fuck you guys.
He was vindicated pretty quickly, though. He was. There was a patrol sergeant parked up down the road a little bit, kind of on Main Street towards the Western Union direction. So west. He knew Jack Ruby and didn't see him. Cab driver was parked almost opposite the other side of the ramp. He never saw anyone walk down there before the shooting. Vaughan, he never stood. He was reported as walking out into the middle of the road to stop traffic to let the Pierce car come up. He didn't do that. No one even saw him step too far out off the sidewalk to let the car out. So it's just BS. It didn't happen. But what I'm saying is the way that Ruby did get into position, he didn't have to. He was getting into position behind people that were looking away. He was there for merely. He could have been there from anywhere between 10, 20 seconds to a minute in place. Everyone had their eyes peeled on the corridor that Oswald was to come down. It's little wonder no one was looking in the direction that he was in. He was just off to the side. So it's little wonder, particularly press from out of town, didn't could, and I'm sure quite honestly say, no, didn't we did not see Jack Ruby before the shooting took place, because he was basically hidden behind Blackie Harrison. The footage of the Bob Jackson photograph that's got the big guy putting the cigar to his mouth as Ruby shooting Oswald. That's Blackie Harrison. That's who Ruby was standing behind and was basically sheltered by. So he got in. He didn't get in as a member of the press. There was another story that he was helped wheel a camera into position that came down, albeit a little bit too late, from the third floor. Came down the same elevator that Oswald would come down in about, I think it was about 4 or 5 minutes later, so they really left it too late. It was said that Ruby was part of the people that were pushing the camera along the tripod. But you see footage. There is footage, raw KRLD TV footage showing the camera being brought out, and there's only two people pushing it along. You can see. So, and Ruby's timing with coming from the Western Union office to having transferred the money, he had his receipt stamped at 11:17 a.m. That didn't leave him too much time to enter the basement through up through the main City Hall building and come down the elevator or even stairs from there. It was a much more direct route, and he was let in.
Whenever you look at some of these oral histories of some of these Dallas police officers, they're very apologetic towards the reputation of Dallas that it received after the assassination. It's kind of like I did a clip on the death of JFK and just like the remarks from certain presidents and people that made in political power that made statements. Eisenhower's probably the weirdest for me because his whole 5 minute interview he did not once mention Kennedy's name. He just said this is bad towards the president being killed, and what does that do to the American idea of the president? He just literally talked up the position. It could have been wide ranging for. He talked about Mrs. Kennedy. He didn't talk about JFK though. But then he talked about like I forgot what it was. Someone asked him what he was doing, and he was like, "I'm going to be retiring to my lakefront cabin," and some shit like that. Where I was like, "You're a dick, dude." And there's one thing I wanted to mention about that was the reputation of Dallas. Eventually, a lot of these officers became apologetic towards it, but then they also started pushing, instead of the blame being put on the city of hate, they started pushing it on to Jesse Curry. And it's Thomas C. Dillard, which called, in an oral history interview, called Jesse Curry stupid for all the remarks. I mean, the amount that you look at this, and we can say it's quarterbacking, but at no time should have any information been relayed to the press over the safety of the person that they had in custody. And it makes you wonder what was going on when Oswald was in jail, when he was in police custody through the interrogations. But I mean, there's another clip. I forgot. I'm trying to remember what his name is. I have it somewhere on my phone. But he recalled every time he saw Oswald going to an interrogation. His name is Dick Wheeler. Every time he saw Oswald going back and forth to an interrogation, he states in an oral history, he looked worse. So whether that's conditions that he's being treated in, beating him down for a confession, the way that people describe the way Decker or not Decker, Fritz would interrogate people and get the answers that he wanted. These questions all have to be raised, but you have a chapter in your book, and I'm hoping this goes along the same question, but it's about the inmate number. I think it's chapter 4. Could you maybe describe what some of that's about, if that happens to deal with Oswald or yeah?
Yeah, so I just get that comes at a time in the book where the way I've structured is to give a bit of context first. So I talk very briefly about the assassination and of course the manhunt for Officer Tippett's shooting and how Oswald would come to be arrested at the Texas Theatre. So I just took a moment there to really just and I didn't want to take reference Bart Camp's book more than a fuzzy picture because his book really lays out how poorly Oswald was treated in terms of uh, the lack of access to legal representation, Oswald asking for it, asking for a shower, or demanding not to be led in lineups next to people that didn't resemble him, that were dressed completely differently. So I just wanted to give a bit of a context around Oswald and how poorly he was treated because it really didn't it continued after he was shot as well, and we can go into that a little bit later because that's probably the most suspicious part of the Dallas police's handling of Oswald's shooting was how badly he was treated after. But it just sets up how at the end of the day he was a human, and he had the right to the presumption of innocence before being proved guilty. And he did not get that, and his legal and human rights were violated in Dallas police custody. And like you say, his condition you can see in footage as well. It got worse and worse as he was being paraded around. But he kept very calm the whole time. Whenever he was out before the eyes of the press, and by all reports, and maybe this is where the frustration and whatever treatment he was dealt came from. He was very cool and calm when being interrogated as well, because frankly, my personal opinion is, I don't think he had too much to say. He didn't shoot J.D. Tippett. Definitely didn't fire at President Kennedy either. So they had nothing on him. They certainly were purporting to the press that they did, but that was the way back then. They projected his guilt to form that bias. And the way the system worked back then, it was the judicial system and the jury, all that would fall in behind. The conviction would happen before the presumption of guilt would happen before the trial. So I think he was being set up for that, if not just being set up to be killed from the outset.
I wonder if since he moved around and was relatively new to the kind of like the Dallas area after returning back from Russia, I wonder if he was too aware of the kind of conviction rates that were going on in the Dallas Police Department. Maybe that's because I feel like if he was a different person that was born and raised in Dallas, and he would have stayed in Dallas, and this would have been a situation that he was involved in, I feel like you'd be screaming at the top of your lungs that, oh my God, I mean, he did for a brief amount of time, but I mean, all throughout, like, oh, something's bad's going to happen to me. I'm going to get the electric chair or something like that. And I didn't do it. But a lot of people bring up, you could tell he's a CIA asset because he's so composed. And I'm like, well, also, if you didn't do anything wrong, then you don't have anything to be worried about. I mean, he was responding to questions that were asked to him. He wasn't being a jerk. He wasn't really, in my opinion, being ignorant. He's just someone that was like, hey, I didn't do this. I'm wasting time right now. I mean, he had a newborn baby. He had a younger child also. So you got to really examine all these factors. There's not a whole lot of motive or want for him to go and put his whole life and family on the line.
Mm. One thing he wasn't was provocative. So when he was apprehended at Texas Theatre, he was very smart to start yelling straight away, "I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not resisting arrest," because he might have, with the context that you talk about, and any knowledge that he might have had about local law enforcement and corruption and all of that, he might have sensed that, I'm fixing to be shot here for trying to flee or to resist arrest. So he started saying it straight away. I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not, therefore taking away the impetus and the justification to shoot him in some kind of self defence. And I go into that in the book as well, in terms of when he was in custody. He might have seen everything that was being piled on him, but and the reaction for most would have been to be pleading and begging for mercy and understanding and screaming, whenever you had a chance to be heard by the press. But he I think he clearly knew that all he needed to do was just bide his time, not give them any reason to be provoked, and that's what he was doing, and ultimately they got him anyway.
Especially if you're not a fan of police or you're not a fan of the American government, and you're just sitting there in your cell and you hear some guy come up to another dude and just go, "Yep, we're gonna charge him for killing the president and for killing a police officer." You're just sitting in your cell like, "What? What? Like, excuse me? Can you rewind?" I mean, eventually you have to be like, they're just going to keep piling more on there. You start to get a little bit defensive. So I think when you examine his interrogations, a lot more people will be open to things that they've never seen before, like the questions about Mexico City and stuff that really was not well public knowledge until later when documents became released that there was this whole Mexico City venture. There was this, why was he doing all this? And I know the official story says he went there or some stuff like that, but there's a lot of things that really hint at intelligence or some type of thing involved that he was at least involved in.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. Look, I do, again, for context sake, I do talk about the impersonations of Oswald. There were clear, proven instances where Oswald was impersonated, in the weeks leading up to November 22nd. Buying a or taking a car for a test drive when he didn't drive. Bragging, um, downgrading the car compared to those in Russia that he would be able to afford to buy over there, and he was still about to come into a large sum of money. And the audio incident as well. That there's quite a few instances of where, he was clearly impersonated. He was being set up, and I think that happened very late. The die was set, the trick was in. His setup for Dallas kicked in very late in September. He'd been kicked around in New Orleans following the orders of people like Guy Bannister and David Ferry. Be an agent provocateur, infiltrate local communist elements. Help out the anti-Castro elements. He was playing both sides. And that was a mission that he was on then, but I personally don't think it had too much to do with what would ultimately happen in Dallas. If you understand, or if you've heard about the case of Richard Nagel, he blew up a plot. He heard about a plot that was in the works against President Kennedy to take place in Baltimore, I think, or in Washington in September of 1963, and he blew it. Might Oswald have been being set up for that? And then when that didn't happen, things moved, and he himself was literally moved back to Dallas. There was so many fingerprints all over him, and why should it be any different that his death was also, so suspicious and curious?
I have to ask about speculation on who you think might have ordered Jack Ruby to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. You mentioned the organized crime. Maybe we can talk about that angle briefly. And then I honestly think it was a Dallas police officer. Um, just on the weight of the evidence that was created or fabricated against Oswald and the conditions that Oswald was being treated in, I think if that would have went to court, it just wouldn't have passed. I think a judge probably would have let him off, depending on the judge. If the judge had an LBJ connection, maybe not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the mob were very convenient, and I think they are in certain aspects of the Kennedy assassination as well. Don't think they had too much to do with that either. But you hear stories about Rosselli and Chuck Nicoletti and these supposed mob assassins that were in Dealey Plaza, and I don't they weren't needed. They were more useful to the to plot to be kind of like scapegoats, if you like, after the
Well, we talk
fact.
about Harvey, William Harvey being sent to Rome as a punishment, but then we look at Jack Ruby talking about he has mob connections or underworld connections in Chicago that nobody can account for. But Jack Ruby, I go, maybe he was the lackey, like the guy in The Godfather who got shot in the back of the head on the fucking canoe. They shipped him out to Dallas saying, "Get the hell out of here, dude."
Yeah, I'm not sure why he was sent to Dallas. I'm kind of reading some of his early history, and again, I don't want to take away from anyone else that's done the work on that side of things. But I gather he had some kind of business venture with his brother, one of his brothers, that yeah, I think San Francisco, California, was something to do with out there, and fizzled out, and he ended up in Dallas, having followed his brother Hyman, one of his brothers anyway. It's not something I cover in this book again because I don't just focusing on the Oswald shooting. But I don't think the mob needed to be involved in used rather in having Ruby shoot Oswald. I think because those connections were there, and if someone had enough knowledge to know of all of Ruby's other connections, he makes a very, very good candidate to be the person responsible for shooting Oswald. And I think the mastermind was William Westbrook. I think he was in the person in DPD that you talk about, and I agree. He put it together. He is a prime candidate for putting it together. He was essentially the captain of personnel, so head of human resources. He knew of all the comings and goings, the movements, the connections of Dallas police officers. There are a couple of instances of suspicious characters within the DPD that happened to be transferred to the division that they were in at the time of Oswald's shooting. Um, Westbrook would have been in a position to orchestrate that. Westbrook was also part of the investigation into the Oswald shooting. So, I mean, that sounds familiar if you think about Alan Dulles being on on the Warren Commission, someone knowing which doors to keep closed, and which ones to let people run down and get lost in. So I think Westbrook is a very, very good candidate for being behind the shooting. He would have had the clout to go up to someone like Curry, like Fritz, and say something's happening. It's for the sake of national security. Oswald can't go on. He's too connected and all the wrong places. Something's happening this morning. No one will get hurt. It's just follow my lead kind of thing. I think it could have been as easy as that. And in terms of Ruby himself, he was such a news hound. He was such a groupie. The pitch to him would have been pretty straightforward. Jack, do this for us. It'll be a couple of years. It'll be a crime of passion. You won't get the death sentence. It'll be a crime of passion. You'll walk out in a couple of years a hero. You'll be doing what a lot of us in the DPD wished we could have done. So I think that's how it would have been pitched to him. Jack Ruby allegedly had $7,000 of cash on him on the afternoon of the assassination. He was told off by a teller at the Merchant Bank in Dallas for carrying so much cash on him. Might that have been an advance payment to take care of all of his tax worries that he was in at the time as well? I'm not sure, but
I wonder if he went to jail or if he got in a serious crime, if all that tax stuff would have went away, and that might have been a motive for him to be able to do some of that, because that was the first thing the IRS did when Jack Ruby died, was to go after his taxes and shit like that. I think it's even in the Warren Commission is his tax records as well too. But I have to ask about when we talk about the motive for Jack Ruby, him being like, hey, it's going to be a couple of years, you'll go away. When did that change? Because it got brought up about him being sentenced to the electric chair or being, put to death.
so this is where it gets very interesting, and it really it turned for him straight away. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of the cover up coming in straight away. There was also the implication of piling on Jack Ruby, not just literally, with all those detectives on him in the basement, but afterwards. There's a really interesting little episode that happened up on the fifth floor. So you picture Jack Ruby being taken up the jail elevator up to the fifth floor, He's stripped of all of his clothes. They've cleared out the fifth floor jail, so he's literally he's not even in a jail cell. They're holding him in the corridor in the middle of the jail cells. You've got a couple of uniformed officers, and you've got three detectives with him. So you've got Clardy, you've got Archer, and you've got McMillan. There were three of the detectives that accompanied Ruby up to the fifth floor from the basement. They were there at the time of the shooting as well. And a few minutes later, Sergeant Dean brings Secret Service agent Forrest Sorrells up to speak with Ruby on I guess on the pretense that because Dean was heading up security, he needed to know from Ruby how he was able to breach security of the basement. That was apparently the reason why he went up there. Forrest Sorrells had the first crack at Jack Ruby in terms of getting to ask him questions. Didn't really get too much from him. We have a pretty good account of what he asked Ruby and what Ruby said from Sorrells. And by and large, it's backed up by the other detectives that are up there. Sergeant Dean's there as well. So Sorrells leaves the fifth floor, leaving Ruby alone with Sergeant Dean, McMillan, Archer, and now I forgot Clardy. And now it was apparently, it gets mixed up very early that Ruby actually told, while Sorrells was there, or maybe not, that he spoke of how he entered the basement down the Main Street ramp. And, the reason he shot Oswald was because he saw, the outpouring of grief. He heard of a letter that was written to Caroline Kennedy. All these things were apparently coming out where Ruby was saying this. But the thing is, it's BS because Sorrells didn't hear. He didn't note down, and we have Sorrells' notes. He didn't note down then at that time Ruby saying that he came down the Main Street ramp. That story was concocted by Sergeant Dean, and only after the fact. We know it was after the fact because McMillan, Clardy, and Archer, in their initial statements to not only the DPD but also the FBI, they didn't make mention of this massive, hugely important thing being said by Ruby of how he got into the basement. There was no mention of that. They only started to say that after Dean gave his first statement, which right from the start was saying that Jack Ruby told them up on the fifth floor, wasn't clear if Sorrells was with them or not, that Ruby sang like a hummingbird about how he was able to enter the Main Street ramp. So this little story, I'm kind of painting a bit of a big picture here, but ultimately that was the starting point of incriminating Jack Ruby as killing Oswald with premeditation. McMillan, Clardy, and Dean would all testify at Jack Ruby's trial, and it was their testimony, in particular Dean's, that was probably the most damning against Ruby, because subsequently he said all these things about what Ruby told him. When he first saw Oswald smirking on the Friday night, he knew he wanted to kill him. When he was, there at Dallas City Hall during the press conference, he had a gun on him. All these things, and all of that came from Patrick Dean, and that came out at his trial, at Ruby's trial, and that was the most damning thing against Ruby, even though the lawyers by that time for him, Belly and Hill, were talking about still the psychotic episode, or that he even had some kind of spasm. He flinched, and that's how he was able to shoot Oswald. There was all sorts of craziness going on. Dean came in, and with the help of Clardy and McMillan, sealed it. That was it. Ruby was done then, and that's how he was sentenced to death.
Do you believe the whole spur of insanity nonsense about all that? I think even it's been well exposed now. I think there's an interview with Robert Dennison I mentioned with you off air that talks about Melvin Belli. He's like, man, you gotta really sell the Sun there to be able to get that to go through. But Melvin Belli was convinced he could do it.
Ruby was, there was no doubt, at the very least, Ruby was on drugs. He was, I think he even admitted to being on Preludin.
Have you seen his jail drawings?
No, no.
Dude, oh my, I have to send you these. He did this freehand, but they are 100% symmetrical diamonds like in like a weird like maze labyrinth shape. And the guy in an oral history interview, who's the jailer, he framed him and gave him to, because Jack Ruby gave him to his kids. He goes, give this to your kids. And he's drawing freehand, no ruler. This is explained, no ruler. I'm telling you, when you look at these pictures, you go, there's no way. He should have been painting the ceiling of the cathedral in Vatican or whatever. But
There's,
there's
there's probably an
symmetrical
answer in those
diamonds.
drawings.
And it's like you look at it and I go, I sent it to like 50 people. I go, real quick, in one answer, what would you give me when I send you this? And I sent that to him and everyone responded, drugs. I go, exactly. That is exactly what everyone describes.
Look, and we can talk about that because Ruby, as soon as he was subdued for shooting Oswald, he was saying, "Guys, why are you? I'm Jack Ruby. You know who I am. Why are you beating me up?" And there's one other testimony of him being told up on the fifth floor what he did, and him reacting to finding out what he did. So was it drugs or was it something else? Some kind of hypnosis or God knows what. But he was there. He was at the very least we can see Ruby being led through the jail office to the jail elevator by Blackie Harrison, and they're then joined by other officers. Ruby was there on the scene. There's no doubt. But in what condition? Preludin. That's some kind of dexiamphetamine. It's legal speed back then. God knows if it's still around now, but he was on something for sure, at the very least.
What I know I got to ask you this, but when do you think that he would have been given drugs if you believe he was on drugs? Because that's what
Given or taken them.
I've tried to narrow it down to like when he would have even had someone would have contacted him. I know there's Jolly West that people bring up with the MK Ultra stuff, um, but I kind of wonder if it was a little bit before.
I think so. I go a little bit of a ways to trace his movements, literally from the incident of Julianne Mercer, who thinks she saw Ruby, behind the wheel of a pickup truck in Dealey Plaza just an hour and a half before Kennedy's assassination. I trace Ruby's known and speculated movements between then and shooting Oswald, and God, he was busy. He was all over the place that weekend. I mean, and sometimes he would be, in the depths of grief, and then other times, the night before the shooting, he was over at one of the newspaper offices showing off how a twist board works with some of the young ladies that worked in the copy office there at the time. So, really happy, and he was brokering interviews for KLIF radio with Henry Wade. Like, it was, you cannot predict or get it's very hard to understand exactly what his baseline was that weekend. It's very difficult, and I think it might have, and that might be an indication that he was always on something. He was, and therefore might have doped himself up even more for what he knew he had to do or where he had to be that Sunday morning.
I think there's a lot of evidence that kind of goes against, I guess, Ruby's actions for shooting Oswald. In particular, him booking things after that weekend. Like, I don't know if he would have planned it just because he thought he could get off. I think that was he just it was it might have been as someone just said you're doing this, and he had to go and just feel like he needed to go do it. I just don't believe the whole random spur of patriotic duty, because how many statements do you come across where people are saying that he never once talked about politics? And it's like, if that's your thing to go shoot somebody because you want to spare Jackie Kennedy a funeral or a trial or anything like that, then why would you not mention it beforehand about your political stance?
100%. And even one of his dogs was found, and his most beloved dog, apparently Sheba, yeah, was in the car, and left in the car when he went into the Western Union office, and he'd left, I think, thousands of dollars of notes in his car, and it all could have easily just been a setup to make it look like it was a random act, and yeah, setting things up in his calendar for after the fact, because to make it look like he wasn't premeditating or maybe because he thought he might have just gotten naively thought that he would be protected all the way through by the DVD and declared a hero. I'm not sure, but he willingly took himself to Dallas City Hall. We can be pretty sure of that.
Can I ask, you mentioned earlier about the after stuff that happened with Lee Harvey Oswald after he was shot.
Mm. It's terrible. I mean, that was one of the first things that compelled me to dive into the whole Oswald shooting. I don't know about you, but it always struck me as strange that they just didn't put him in a car and just drive him straight to a hospital. I still don't get why they didn't do that, especially when a car had just left, was fairly easily able to exit the Main Street ramp literally a minute earlier. So to me, that always seemed suspicious that they didn't want to give Oswald the any kind of urgent care or attention. But the strange thing is as well is you get some real mix of reports from people there on the scene. So Detective Graves, who had Oswald by Oswald's left arm, he was one of the detectives standing next to him, and he was the one that was able to wrestle Ruby's pistol out of his hand. In his statement, which was unsigned, typewritten, and undated, it says that Graves said that Oswald was put into, after being shot, loaded into an ambulance immediately and rushed to hospital. That's number one. Detective Ramsey, who was further up the ramp closer to the armoured car near Commerce Street, he said that Ruby was taken into the jail office first. And when he helped somehow with taking Ruby into the jail office, he came back out and saw that Oswald was still lying on the floor. And then he was loaded into the ambulance and taken away. How can you get things so wrong? It clearly did not happen that way in the footage. It is just absolutely amazing.
Well, in the footage, he gets shot and they put him right in the ambulance, I think, less than like a minute before. I don't like I've seen statements of people saying that he was pulled back inside with Ruby, but I watched the shooting video, so unless they spliced it.
it's 3 minutes. Three works out. So the ambulance arrived 3 minutes after. It was actually 4.5 minutes after the shooting took place, and that was 3 minutes after it was first called and dispatched. The O'Neill ambulance. So you can watch the continuous footage. The KRLD footage is really good. It's continuous. So Oswald, for all intents and purposes, he was in the jail office for up to 5 minutes. God knows what they were doing to him in there, because of course he was put behind the counter. He and Ruby, they were fairly close together. If you have a look where Ruby was being brought from and where Oswald was said to have been, right in the middle of the counter in the back of the jail office there. And some people said that Oswald was conscious. Robert Henkel, one of the news guys, he said that he saw detectives leaning over Oswald saying, confess, have you got anything to say? Have you got anything to say? Other people, including the first aid medical intern, said that Oswald was unconscious. So there's, even on that front, there's so many contradictions. But God knows what they were doing to him back there out of the side of the media. I mean, did they do something to make sure that Ruby's gunshot actually was did the trick? I'm not sure, but it was a good minute, maybe 2 minutes before he was given medical assistance by Fred Bieberdorf. But even him, he's a very he couldn't. His statements are all over the place as well, and the Dallas police investigation didn't even speak to him. It was only the FBI and the Warren Commission that spoke to him, and it's just crazy. In his first FBI statement, it said it took him several minutes to get from the back of the corridor, so near where Tom Howard would have been standing, to where Oswald was shot, and then it took him a few minutes to work out where Oswald had been taken. Just absolute lunacy. It just did not happen. He was let in, and he was eventually able to get to Oswald. But even then, he got it wrong by saying that Ruby was lying face up when Ruby was always face planted on the floor of the jail office and being handcuffed and all of that. So this guy got so many things wrong. And then when he couldn't hear a heartbeat, he starts giving him CPR. So he presumed he was dead. So he thought he would possibly do the worst thing you could do for someone that has just been shot, just below, the mid torso. So just crazy. And then to add final insult to injury, I've jumped around a lot, but it took 40 seconds for the armoured car to start back up and move. So the ambulance that was just sitting there with Oswald loaded up to get out. I mean, they couldn't have, honestly, could not have done any more to have mistreated Oswald. And then if you hear about the ambulance drive, that's interesting. Apparently, Oswald was thrashing about in the back of the ambulance, and that Bieberdorf was trying to put keep his oxygen mask on him. That's in one statement, but in another, there's no account of Oswald thrashing about by anyone in the ambulance. It's just crazy, absolutely crazy.
Do
Don't.
you, do you believe the LBJ phone call that occurred when Oswald was at Parkland Hospital? I don't know if you know too much about that.
Yeah, Charles Crenshaw wrote about that in his book. Yeah, very, very possible. Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure it would have happened. And apparently, there was a man in glasses and dark suit, standing in the theatre while Oswald was being operated on. If that was anyone, it was probably Secret Service agent Elmer Moore. He was pretty prolific that weekend. But yeah, I'd believe that for sure.
Because I think Bart talks about people trying to get a confession out of Oswald when he's lying on the hospital table. So I always questioned. I was like, I think I've seen two different accounts of just Secret Service dressed up like Bart says in doctors' uniforms and in there trying to get a confession out of him. And then I know about the LBJ phone call from Crenshaw. But yeah, it makes it even more suspicious. Like, I mean, I don't think he was conscious at the hospital. I think it was something along the ambulance ride. He just went unconscious.
Well, Crenshaw's book's really good because well, firstly, it correlates with the autopsy report of Oswald. So Oswald was shot just over the seventh rib at a pretty downward angle because the bullet traversed slightly downwards and ended up just on the inside of his 11th rib on his right side. So it didn't travel all the way through. If it did, then Lavelle probably would have gotten shot. The detective in the white who was standing with him at the time, but it split his like his aorta valve, his spleen, his kidney. Like he needed obviously attention right away. Some kind of I think Crenshaw, he said Ringer's lactate, which basically keeps the circulation going, because that's ultimately what Oswald died from was shock, hemorrhagic shock. So all the fatty deposits and things that had built up while he was dead, essentially, he's lost circulation in his system. When they were fighting to bring him back to life at Parkland Hospital, and they did restore his circulation to somewhat, all these toxins that had built up overloaded his heart, and that's how he died.
It's crazy because you look at how bad JFK's autopsy was, and then if you look at how, I mean, I wouldn't say thorough, but his actual autopsy was thorough, Oswald's, but that it was just the treatment before his death. It was kind of like all these people, like if that's our medical practices back then, it just seems so strange because, I mean, I'm not the best with doctors, but I don't know. I feel like a lot of this stuff could have been largely avoided if there would have been more of a collaboration amongst people.
If they got him to hospital, he had a delay of 5 minutes. That's putting it mildly. If he was able to get out of there straight away, put into the car that he was being walked to, the armoured car, or even if it reversed up Main Street ramp to the Main Street ramp, might have stood a chance. But no one ever asked the question why that did not happen. And I think now with everything else that I've uncovered in my book, what we our suspicions in terms of an inside job, I think we know why it was allowed to happen, and Oswald was never going to be helped in any meaningful or proper way once it did happen.
Did you find it difficult to find a publisher that would look or try and publish something
I've
that?
Yeah, I'd self-publish this. So it's yeah, I just wanted to get the story out. I think it's a book that anyway, as we come up to Oswald's birthday, but I think it amazes me that nobody. I know there have been books that have been titled as being dedicated to Oswald's shooting, but that I've not found. And I did look. I did look. I did. The last thing I wanted to do was rehash someone else's work. Could not find it. It was a story that as soon as I'd verified some pretty solid narratives and themes about what happened, I just wanted to get it out. So I don't do all the work for the reader as well. I the way I've structured it is I kind of treat it as if it's an onion, peeling back the layers. Start off, and it's literally called on the surface. What this is what we know has happened, and we go peel back another layer and focus on the investigations, and that's actually how I put the book together. I didn't go straight to the HSCA and look at the four possible scenarios that they basically said were possible were the ways that Ruby could have entered the basement. I didn't do that. I started with the Dallas police investigation, and that's because of the Garrison Index project I'd done before. So I pulled apart all of the testimonies and statements from Dallas police and statements that they'd taken from a small amount of the press. They only took 10 statements from press in total. That itself is another tangent. And then I looked on to what the FBI did because they kicked in pretty much straight away. The story goes that J. Edgar Hoover thought that they would be the ones that would be handling the investigation, and of course politically, that wasn't something that was allowed to happen. It wouldn't have been good for Johnson to not have that control, especially coming up to
I
chance.
don't even think that's a story. I think that's recorded. It's on the LBG tapes on, and which I'm surprised that's not like everyone's like, I'm surprised like there are people that would even be like, there's no conspiracy. I'm like, you even hear
It's right there. Yeah.
Johnson on the tape say that I would prefer that your report talking to J. Edgar Hoover would be the main thing we'd go off of. But I have a feeling that there's going to be other entities that are going to try and open this thing up. So we need to have a commission come together, and it'll be largely fixed and based on your FBI conclusion and reports. I'm like, he just fucking said it. Like, I can't get any more like horse's mouth type shit. You know what I mean?
There you go. But look, yeah, even the differences in statements that people gave to the DPD and then the FBI, and even a few months later, the Warren Commission, when that kicked in with its hearings. That's what I did. I recorded, wrote down every single statement I could find, collected it, saw where there were little anomalies, who corroborated who, and was able to draw up a really, I think, the most clearest picture of what happened in the basement that weekend. And this is, Robbie, this is a subject that mainstream press don't deal in, or they do, but it's a very in a very single tone way. So I didn't really bother looking for a publisher too much. It's just something that I think the research community could benefit from, because if anything, if we talk about someone sensibly like Westbrook and Croy, that there's a potential linkage to obviously what happened on November 22nd as well. And I think we can safely conclude that the shootings of President Kennedy, Tippit, and Oswald were all connected.
Well, Paul, I appreciate the work that you do for the research community, and you are doing and publishing on your own too. It's not an easy task. I think it takes a lot for a lot of people to write a lot of books or just write a book in general and be able to condense their words, and especially such an expansive topic into you have I think 414 pages. Did you have to leave out anything in your book that you wanted to include in there?
No, not really. It's all pretty much on there. There are a few little peripheral characters that popped up across the basement. There was someone that looked like the actor. Who was it now?
Gary Busey?
Sorry, yeah, Carradine, John Carradine, a relative of David Carradine. Anyway, someone said that this guy looked like John Carradine, the actor, and he had a folder with him, and he looked like an insurance salesman, and he was trying all kinds of ways to get into the basement at the time leading up to the shooting. Apparently, he'd been around City Hall, that weekend. People viewed him with a bit of suspicion. There was the initial story of an old man being the person that shot Oswald. So there's all those little tangents, but probably the thing I'm most happiest to get out is the media. The media, that's probably the biggest thing that I uncovered with my investigation or look into the Oswald shooting, was there was literally, and I account for every single person, a 50-50 ratio of Dallas police to media within the direct vicinity of Oswald shooting. And again, I back that up with witness statements, not statements corroborating other people's presence and movements. 50-50 headcount in terms of Dallas police to media. That's just insane, and that might go a ways to explaining why there has been such a radio silence, largely speaking, in terms of the media that were there to witness Oswald being shot, because it's their job to observe and report, and yet we got so little, so little from the reporters that were there to actually, who allegedly saw Ruby shoot Oswald. That to me is probably one of the lesser known and most appalling aspects of Oswald's shooting, is just how many credentialed and experienced witnesses, reporters were there, and never did anything about it. We got reporting at the time, recordings, but accounts after, in years later, very little, very little. I've spoken about him before, but Tom Pettit, very, very well-known broadcaster back then. You never heard anything from him whatsoever after the Oswald shooting. There was a known CIA affiliated reporter there at the scene as well, Jerry O'Leary. He was exposed as being a part of Operation Mockingbird in the 70s by Carl Bernstein. Was he CIA back then when Oswald was shot, or was, something that he, or was it just coincidental that he went on to become a very prolific CIA asset across the kind of the South and Central Americas for the CIA? But it's the media aspect that I'm really happy to have gotten out the most. It's appalling how little we know because of the people that were there but didn't speak.
Well, Paul, is there a place where people can find your book? Do you have a link up for it yet?
Yeah, I do. So I'm put together a Substack. So it's Death to Justice: The Shooting of Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm going to link that to a channel on Rumble. So these will be kind of like accompaniments to the book. So obviously, a book you can't really. It's hard to dissect footage too much, but I'm just going to have a couple of avenues that people can check out while maybe looking through my book. It's fully referenced. I include links to all of the interview statements that I got all my information from. There's some 300 to 400 references that people will be able to look out for, and I'll send you the links as well. It's out on my book's out on Kindle and paperback as well. So kind of through your known Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Powell, and all other kind of places. It's starting to hit the shelves, which is really cool.
And if you're listening to the episode, you want to find Paul's links, you can check in the episode description. Make sure I link all his links in there on his previous episodes. I recommend checking out group episode discussions that we've done. And also, he's been on separately for the first time by himself. It was me and him talking for like 2 hours about a whole mess of media problems. But thank you so much for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode.